The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the ceiling fan. The sun had just begun to rise, spilling soft golden light through the kitchen window. John Matthews was already awake, standing at the stove flipping crispy strips of bacon on an old cast-iron skillet. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of breakfast, filling the air with warmth. This was his routine, every day without fail. John wasn't the kind of man who complained. He believed in doing, not talking. His hands were rough from years of work as a mechanic, and his back ached from bending over car engines for hours on end. But every morning, without fail, he was up at 6 a.m., cooking breakfast for his 17-year-old son, Tyler. "Tyler, breakfast's ready." John called from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. No answer. He shook his head, glanced at the clock, 6:45 a.m., and called again, louder this time. "Ty, get down here before I eat it all myself." Nothing. Silence. John sighed, walked over to the stairs, and tilted his head up. "Tyler, don't make me come up there." His voice was firm but not angry. It was the voice of a father who had repeated the same words so many times they'd become part of the morning air. After a few seconds, he heard the familiar shuffle of feet and the heavy thuds of Tyler stomping down the stairs. His son appeared, hoodie up, headphones in, eyes locked on his phone. Tyler didn't even glance up. He moved like a zombie, pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, and sat down with a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Took you long enough," John muttered as he placed a plate in front of him. Scrambled eggs, bacon, and 2 slices of toast, buttered just the way Tyler liked. "I'm not hungry," Tyler said flatly, still scrolling on his phone. John stopped in his tracks. His eyes shifted slowly to his son. "Not hungry, huh? Funny. You were starving last night when you asked me for pizza money." "That was different," Tyler mumbled, still glued to his phone, fingers scrolling like they were on autopilot. "Yeah? How's it different?" John asked, crossing his arms and leaning against the counter. Tyler didn't answer. He'd seen this version of Tyler too many times, detached, distracted, distant. It wasn't always like this. John remembered when Tyler was a little boy who'd run down the stairs every morning, grinning from ear to ear, shouting, "What's for breakfast, Dad?" Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Somewhere between 13 and 17, that boy had disappeared. John glanced down at the plate of food he'd made with care. His fingers tapped lightly on the counter. For a split second, he thought about saying something sharp, something that would teach Tyler a lesson. But he didn't. That's not how John did things. He'd always believed that actions speak louder than words. So he picked up the plate of food, walked to the sink, and scraped it straight into the trash. The sound of the bacon hitting the bottom of the bin caught Tyler's attention. His head shot up, his eyebrows furrowed. "What the heck, Dad? I was gonna eat that." John turned to him slowly, his face calm but firm. "You said you weren't hungry." Tyler pulled out his earbuds, his mouth hanging open like he didn't know what to say. "I mean, I was gonna eat it later." "No later in this house," John said plainly, his voice steady. "You show up or you don't." The kitchen fell silent. Tyler stared at his father, his jaw tight. But he didn't say anything. He just shoved his earbuds back in and went back to his phone. John watched him for a moment longer before picking up a rag and wiping down the counter. He didn't say another word. Some lessons don't need to be spoken. That night, John sat on the couch, a cold beer in his hand, flipping through TV channels. Tyler was upstairs in his room, door closed as usual. It had been like that for months now. Door closed, headphones on, locked away from the world, locked away from him. John rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a deep, exhausted sigh. He thought about his own father, a man who'd never once told him he was proud of him. A man who believed that providing was all that mattered. As long as there's food on the table, you're doing your job, his father used to say. But John didn't want to be that kind of father. He wanted more for Tyler. He wanted to be the kind of dad Tyler could talk to. But somewhere along the way, they'd stopped talking. And now, all John could see was that same detached distance his father had with him. How did it get like this? He muttered to himself. When did I stop being his favorite person? The next morning, it was the same routine. John was up at 6 a.m., flipping bacon, making eggs, and calling for Tyler. This time, he didn't yell up the stairs. He just called once. Tyler, breakfast. No response. He didn't call a second time. He sat down at the table with his own plate of eggs and bacon. For the first time in 17 years, John Matthews ate breakfast without serving anyone but himself. He didn't clear Tyler's plate. He didn't scrape food into the trash. He didn't even make Tyler's plate at all. When Tyler finally came downstairs, he noticed it right away. He stood at the edge of the kitchen, looking at the empty table. No plate, no bacon, no eggs. Just John sitting there, drinking his coffee like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Where's my breakfast?" Tyler asked, eyes darting around the kitchen like he'd been robbed. John raised an eyebrow, took a sip of his coffee, and leaned back in his chair. "Figure it out. What's that supposed to mean?" Tyler snapped, his face twisted in confusion. "It means you're 17 years old," John replied, his voice calm but firm. "You know where the eggs are. You know where the pans are. You know how to make breakfast." Tyler scoffed. "So that's it? You're done being a dad?" John leaned forward, locking eyes with his son. "No, Tyler. I'm done doing it all for you." The next few days felt different, and it wasn't just in John's mind, it was in the air. Something had shifted. The house wasn't as noisy as it used to be. There were no more "Dad, can you make me something to eat?" or "Where's my clean shirt?" Instead, there was silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind that lingers in the space between two people who aren't talking. For the first time in years, John didn't feel like he was living his day on a schedule that revolved around his son. He got up, made breakfast for himself, and sat down to eat in peace. No yelling up the stairs. No calls for Tyler to come down. Just him, his eggs, and his coffee. Tyler noticed. He didn't say it, but John could see it in the way his son glanced around the kitchen every morning. The confusion on his face was clear. "Where's my plate?" his eyes seemed to ask. But Tyler was too stubborn to actually say it out loud. On the third day, Tyler finally broke. "So you're really just done cooking for me, huh?" he said with a sarcastic smirk as he stood by the fridge. He pulled it open and grabbed a bottle of orange juice, drinking it straight from the bottle. John, sitting at the table with his coffee, didn't even look up. "Yup. Wow, real mature, Dad," Tyler said with a dry laugh. "What's next? You gonna make me pay rent?" John set his mug down slowly, eyes still focused on the newspaper in front of him. "If that's what it takes for you to learn responsibility, maybe." Tyler froze, the bottle of juice still in his hand. His face twisted with disbelief. "You're not serious." John folded the newspaper neatly and finally looked up at his son. "Try me." There was a long pause. Tyler stared at his father like he was looking at a stranger. It was the first time in a long time that John didn't back down. He didn't give in. No apologies. No long explanations. Just calm, steady resolve. "You figure it out, son." The tension builds. Tyler started acting out in small ways, the way teenagers do when they feel like they're losing control. He'd stomp around the house a little louder. He'd leave his dirty dishes on the table, fully expecting John to pick them up like he always did. But John didn't. After dinner one night, John left his own plate in the sink and went straight to the living room. Tyler watched him from the kitchen, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. "You're just gonna leave your plate there?" he asked, his voice sharp with irritation. John didn't even turn around. "Yup. You always tell me to clean my plate," Tyler shot back, his arms folded like he'd just caught his dad in a lie. John clicked on the TV remote, scrolling through the channels. "I always told you to clean yours," he said, his eyes still on the screen. The silence that followed was thick. Tyler stood there for a moment, like he wasn't sure whether to yell, argue, or walk away. He picked option 3. His footsteps pounded up the stairs. A second later, John heard his bedroom door slam shut. But John didn't flinch. Not this time. The unspoken realization. That night, after the house had gone quiet, John sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. He wasn't as calm as he looked earlier. It hurt. Not just the distance between him and his son, but the realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd let it happen. He thought back to all the years he'd spent doing everything for Tyler. Laundry, dishes, cooking, cleaning up his messes, filling in permission slips, running to the store late at night for that one thing Tyler forgot he needed for school the next day. He'd done it all because he loved him. Because that's what fathers do, right? They provide. They sacrifice. But now for the first time, he wondered if he'd done too much. If by doing everything, he'd taught Tyler that nothing was his responsibility. Was this my fault? He thought. That question sat with him all night. It's a hard question for any parent to face. A clash of wills. The next morning, Tyler didn't come downstairs for breakfast at all. Not even to argue. John noticed, but he didn't say a word. He had learned something about parenting that his own father never taught him. Sometimes silence is more powerful than shouting. When Tyler finally appeared around noon, wearing his hoodie pulled up like shield, he walked straight to the fridge. He opened it, saw that there was no ready-to-eat food, and slammed it shut. "Nothing to eat in this house," he muttered loud enough for John to hear. John, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looked up. "Plenty of food in that fridge. You just don't want to cook it." "I'm not a chef, Dad," Tyler grumbled, opening the freezer this time, searching for something instant. "Didn't think I was either," John shot back, tapping his mug with his finger. "But I figured it out." Tyler rolled his eyes so hard it was a miracle they didn't get stuck. He pulled out a box of frozen waffles, threw 2 in the toaster, and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. "This your whole plan, Dad?" Tyler asked with a smirk. "Teach me a lesson so I turn out like you?" John chuckled softly, sipping his coffee. "I'd be proud if you did." "Yeah, well, I'm not going to be some old man who spent his whole life working on cars," Tyler shot back, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm going to be something more." John raised his eyebrows, set his mug down slowly, and looked at his son with steady eyes. "More than me, huh?" "Yeah," Tyler said, his voice sharp and sure. "I'm not going to be stuck doing what you do." John leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, his eyes locked on Tyler's. "Son, I hope you are more than me. I hope you do more, have more, and become more than I ever was. But if you think doing more means disrespecting the man who's been in your corner since day one, then you're already less." The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Tyler's face dropped. The smirk disappeared. He didn't have a comeback for that one. He just stared at his father, his lips pressed tight like he was trying to hold something back. "Eat your waffles," John said calmly, leaning back in his chair. "They're gonna get cold." Tyler sat down, his eyes still on his father, but this time there was something different in his face. Something like recognition. The tension between John and Tyler had reached its peak, but something was different now. The silent standoff had shifted into something more complex, a quiet understanding that neither of them was willing to admit just yet. Tyler started to notice things he hadn't before. Little things, like how his clothes didn't magically appear folded on his bed anymore. His school supplies weren't waiting for him in his backpack, and the lunch he usually grabbed on the way out wasn't ready. The first time it happened, Tyler felt annoyed. "Where's my stuff?" he asked out loud, walking through the house like he was searching for something stolen. John was at the kitchen table, eyes on the sports section of the newspaper. "Your stuff," John said without looking up. "Wherever you left it." Tyler's jaw clenched. "You always put it in my bag." John turned a page of the newspaper. "Not anymore." Tyler stormed up the stairs, muttering words that he knew better than to say out loud. He threw open his bedroom door, rifled through his desk drawers, and eventually found the notebook he'd been looking for, crumpled, half filled with old notes. As he shoved it into his backpack, a realization hit him. He didn't know how to be organized because he never had to. Over the next few days, small cracks began to form in Tyler's confidence. He missed the bus twice because he forgot to set an alarm. He ran out of clean clothes because he'd never done his own laundry before. Each time, he found himself walking downstairs, ready to ask his dad for help, but something stopped him. Pride. He didn't want to admit that his dad was right, but something else stopped him too. John didn't offer help anymore. That realization hit harder than Tyler expected. Every time he looked at his father, sitting at the kitchen table drinking his coffee in peace, Tyler felt something new: isolation. For years, he'd lived in a world where everything was done for him. Now that world had changed, and no one told him the rules. On Friday night, Tyler was in his room scrolling through his phone. His friend Jake had just texted him, "Party at Kyle's house. You coming?" Tyler's thumb hovered over the screen. He knew he needed a ride. Before, he'd just ask his dad to drop him off. No questions asked. But now, with everything that had been going on, he hesitated. After 10 minutes of pacing back and forth, he finally walked downstairs, trying to act casual. John was on the couch, eyes on the TV, a ball game playing at a low volume. Tyler leaned against the wall, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. "Hey, Dad," he started. "Can you give me a ride to Kyle's?" John didn't even turn his head. "You a skin or telling?" Tyler frowned. "I'm asking." John leaned forward, grabbed the remote, and muted the TV. He sat there for a moment, rubbing his hands together, like he was thinking about something deeper than a ride to a party. Finally, he turned and looked Tyler in the eyes. "What's at Kyle's?" John asked. His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't suspicious. It was just steady. "Just some friends," Tyler muttered, looking at the floor. "Gonna hang out." John nodded slowly. "You been handling your responsibilities this week?" Tyler blinked. "What?" "Responsibilities," John repeated. "Your laundry. Your schoolwork. Cleaning up after yourself. You do all that this week." Tyler felt the heat rise in his chest, a mix of frustration and embarrassment. "What's that got to do with Kyle's party?" "Everything," John said plainly. "You want to act grown, you gotta handle grown folks' business first. You want a ride, you tell me what you handled." Tyler's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind searched for something, anything that would count as responsibility, but all he had were excuses. He hadn't done the laundry. He hadn't finished that English essay. He hadn't cleaned his room like he said he would. His eyes darted around the room, and he could feel John watching him. "That's what I thought," John said, turning back to the TV. "Party starts at home, son." Tyler's fists clenched in his hoodie pockets. His eyes stung, but he didn't cry. He stormed back upstairs, slammed his door shut, and sat on his bed, breathing heavy like he'd just run a mile. "I hate him," he muttered to himself, his voice cracking just a little. "I hate him so much." But hate wasn't the right word. Not really. It was something else. It was the feeling of being exposed. The next day, Tyler woke up late. The sun was higher in the sky than usual, and for a moment, he didn't care. He scrolled on his phone until he realized something. He didn't hear his dad downstairs. No bacon. No coffee brewing. Silence. He sat up, suddenly alert. Did he leave? He thought, his heart racing just a little. He threw on a t-shirt and walked down the hall, peeking into his dad's room. Empty. The bed was neatly made. No signs of him anywhere. Tyler felt something odd, a flicker of fear. He walked downstairs, searching for signs. The front door was locked. His dad's truck wasn't in the driveway. He left. For the first time, Tyler felt what it was like to be alone. He opened the fridge, saw the same groceries that had been there all week, and realized he was hungry. He scanned the shelves. Raw eggs, bacon, some bread. Nothing ready to eat. "Man, forget this," he muttered, closing the fridge. But as he sat on the couch, his stomach growled. He sat there for 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. Hunger is a powerful motivator. He walked back into the kitchen, opened the fridge, pulled out the eggs, and stared at them like they were written in a foreign language. "How do you even cook these things?" he muttered. His eyes darted to the stove, then to the pan on the rack. He picked it up, inspecting it like it might explode. After another 5 minutes of scrolling on his phone for how to cook eggs, Tyler finally cracked one open. Half the shell ended up in the pan. "Gross," he muttered, fishing it out with a fork. By the time he was done, the eggs were slightly burned on one side and too runny on the other. But he ate them. Every last bite. He sat at the kitchen table, eating his lumpy, ugly eggs, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he'd never felt before. Pride. They weren't good. But they were his. When John came home that afternoon, he didn't say much, just nodded as he walked into the kitchen. He saw the pan on the stove, the cracked eggshells in the trash, and the empty plate in the sink. He didn't say a word about it. Instead, as he grabbed a bottle of water, he glanced at Tyler, sitting on a couch, scrolling on his phone. "Eggs taste better when you make them yourself, huh?" John said casually, twisting the cap off the bottle. Tyler glanced up, his face guarded, like he didn't want to give his dad the satisfaction of being right. But after a moment, he shrugged. "Yeah, kinda." John smirked. "Yeah, they do." The days moved slowly after that, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. Tyler didn't say much, and John wasn't one to fill the silence with empty words. They lived in the same house, but it felt like they were in different worlds. Tyler would walk past John without a glance, and John would sip his coffee like nothing was out of place. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, Tyler caught himself looking at his father differently. How did he do it all those years? It wasn't just cooking or cleaning. It was everything, the bills, the schedules, the work at the shop, and still having time to be there for Tyler. How did he never complain? One Saturday morning, Tyler woke up late again, expecting the usual silence. But this time, he heard something unusual. The sound of a lawnmower. He peeked out his window and saw John pushing the old mower across the yard, sweat soaking through his gray t-shirt. The sun was already high, and it was hot. Real hot. Tyler watched for a moment, eyes squinting against the sunlight. He used to help with that. Back when he was 12, he'd help by holding the bag open while John emptied the grass into it. Back then, he loved spending time with his dad. He stepped away from the window, sat on the edge of his bed, and stared at the floor. He shouldn't be out there alone, Tyler thought. But he didn't move. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, he got up. When Tyler walked outside, John had just finished a row. He was bent forward, hands on his knees, breathing hard. Tyler watched him for a second, noticing the way his dad wiped sweat off his face with his forearm. When did he start looking so old? His shoulders weren't as broad as they used to be. His back wasn't as straight. John noticed Tyler standing there. "What? You finally wake up," he called out, squinting against the sun. His voice wasn't harsh, but it wasn't soft either. It was the voice of a man who was too tired to pretend he wasn't. Tyler shoved his hands in his hoodie pockets. "You good?" John glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, I'm good." "Why?" Tyler shrugged. "Just looks hot out here." John stared at him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Yep, it is." He gripped the lawnmower handle, ready to start the next row. "I can do it," Tyler blurted. He said it so quickly, he almost didn't recognize his own voice. "I'll finish it." John stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "You sure?" Tyler nodded, walking toward him. "Yeah, I got it." John didn't argue. He stepped aside and let Tyler take the handle. For the first time, Tyler felt the full weight of it. It was heavier than it looked. He pushed it forward, feeling every bump and crack in the ground. It wasn't as easy as it seemed from the window. John sat on the porch with a bottle of water, watching Tyler work. He didn't give him instructions. He didn't tell him to move faster or do it right. He just watched. And for once, Tyler didn't roll his eyes or mutter under his breath. He just kept pushing, row after row, step after step. Halfway through, Tyler stopped to catch his breath. His t-shirt clung to his back and sweat dripped down his face. He looked toward the porch, expecting to see John smirking, but his father was just sitting there, drinking his water, his eyes calm. "Don't stop now," John called out. "Halfway done means halfway left." Tyler shook his head, lips tight, but he didn't argue. He just grabbed the handle and kept going. That evening, after dinner, Tyler sat at the kitchen table with a towel draped over his shoulders. His hair was still damp from his shower. John sat across from him, stirring sugar into his cup of tea. For a while, they didn't speak. They didn't have to. Then Tyler said something John didn't expect. "I didn't know it was that hard." John raised his eyes from his tea, his brow lifted in quiet surprise. "What's that?" "The yard," Tyler said, leaning forward, resting his arms on the table. "I didn't know it was that hard." John nodded slowly, his eyes studying his son for a moment. "Most things look easy when you're watching from the window." Tyler didn't have a comeback for that. He just nodded, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. They sat there for a while, neither of them talking. But it wasn't awkward. It felt like something had shifted. Something had been acknowledged. Tyler had seen a glimpse of what his father went through every day. It wasn't just the lawn. It was everything. The work, the wait, the quiet battles no one else sees. And that night, when Tyler went to bed, something unexpected happened. He set an alarm on his phone for 6 a.m. The next morning, John woke up at 6, just like always. He moved quietly, careful not to make too much noise. But as he walked into the kitchen, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Tyler was sitting at the kitchen table, awake, dressed, no phone in sight. John blinked, rubbing his eyes like maybe he wasn't fully awake. Tyler was eating a bowl of cereal, casually flipping through a magazine John had left on the table the night before. He looked up when he saw his dad standing there. "What?" Tyler said, raising an eyebrow. "You acting like you saw a ghost." John's lips twitched into a smile he tried to hide. Didn't expect to see you up. Tyler shrugged. Figured I'd start early. Less hot in the morning. John nodded slowly, walking over to the coffee pot. Smart move. He poured his coffee, keeping his eyes on his son. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. Some lessons don't need to be spoken. Tyler poured himself a second bowl of cereal. He sat there, eating slowly, glancing at his dad every so often. He didn't say it out loud, but it was in his face. He was proud of himself. And for the first time in a long time, John saw it too. Not just the boy. The man his son was becoming. The days following Tyler's early morning wake-up were different. Subtle, but different. The house didn't feel as heavy anymore. John noticed it first. It was in the small things, the tiny shifts that parents are trained to see. Tyler started rinsing his own dishes after dinner. Not every night, but enough for John to notice. His laundry pile wasn't spilling out of the basket like it usually did. The kid even folded a few of his own shirts. He's figuring it out, John thought to himself, sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee like he always did. He didn't say anything to Tyler, though. No need to. Some lessons don't need applause. They just need time to sink in. But just when things were starting to shift, life did what life always does. It threw a curveball. It was Thursday afternoon. John was still at work at the auto shop, his hands deep inside the hood of a '98 Chevy Silverado that had been giving him trouble all week. His phone buzzed in his back pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Missed call, Tyler. John wiped his hands on a rag and dialed back. Tyler picked up on the first ring. Dad, Tyler's voice was shaky. I'm at school. John's heart tightened. What happened? I think I'm in trouble. John's eyes narrowed. What kind of trouble? There was a long pause on the other end. He heard Tyler breathing. It was that shallow, panicked kind of breathing that only comes from realizing you messed up. Big. I was with Jake and Marcus at lunch, Tyler said slowly, like he was forcing himself to admit something. We were joking around, and it got stupid. John didn't interrupt. He knew Tyler needed to say it out loud. We were in the cafeteria, and Marcus dared me to take one of the teacher's coffee mugs as a joke. I didn't think it was a big deal, but she saw me. I tried to give it back, but she told the principal. Silence. They called you, didn't they? Tyler added quietly. John leaned on the hood of the truck, rubbing his eyes with his thumb and forefinger. Yes, son. They called me. Am I in trouble? Tyler's voice cracked, like he was already bracing for the answer. Yup, John replied plainly. I'll be there in 20. John pulled into the school parking lot and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He'd been to that office before. Parent-teacher meetings, report card discussions, the usual stuff. But this felt different. This felt like a test. He walked through the front doors, nodding politely to the receptionist, and made his way to the principal's office. Inside, Tyler sat in a chair, slouched forward, staring at the floor. He didn't look up when John walked in. Afternoon, Mr. Matthews, said Mr. Porter, the principal, a bald man with wire-framed glasses. We appreciate you coming in on short notice. John nodded, eyes shifting to Tyler, who still hadn't looked up. What happened? John asked, his tone even but firm. Mr. Porter explained the situation, the same story Tyler had already told him. Taking the mug, getting caught, the whole thing. It wasn't a serious crime, but it was enough to send a message. The principal glanced at Tyler, then back at John. We'll need him to serve it attention, of course, and write a letter of apology to the teacher. Standard procedure. John nodded. Fair. Mr. Porter leaned forward. But I think it's important we recognize this as a teachable moment. "Oh, I will," John said, his eyes locked on Tyler. "Believe me, I will." Tyler still didn't look up. The ride home was quiet, the kind of quiet that fills the air after a thunderstorm. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, his arms crossed, eyes locked on the window. John glanced at him every now and then, but didn't say anything. Not at first. He waited. He knew Tyler was stewing. He needed that time to think. Halfway home, Tyler finally spoke. "You mad?" John glanced at him briefly, then looked back at the road. "Not mad, son. Disappointed." Tyler flinched. Those words hit harder than any lecture. "I said I was sorry." "Sorry's good," John replied. "But sorry ain't enough." "So what do you want me to do?" Tyler asked, his voice rising in frustration. John's jaw tightened as he kept his eyes on the road. "I want you to think." "About what?" Tyler said, throwing up his hands. "About who you're becoming," John said firmly. "Every choice you make, big or small, shapes the man you're going to be. You want to be the guy who steals a coffee mug for a laugh, or you want to be the man people trust?" Tyler didn't answer. He just stared at the dashboard, his face a mix of anger, guilt, and something else. Shame. That night, after dinner, John sat on the couch with a beer, eyes on the ball game, but his mind wasn't on it. Tyler sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of him, his pen tapping against the paper. John knew what he was doing, writing that apology letter. Every so often, Tyler would glance toward him, like he wanted to say something, but didn't know how to start. Eventually, he did. "I'm not a bad person, Dad." John muted the TV. He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Tyler's. "I know that." Tyler's eyes dropped back to the paper. He hesitated, then said, I just wasn't thinking." John nodded. "That's the problem, Ty. Boys don't think. Men do." Tyler's pen froze on the paper. Those words hit deep, deeper than he expected. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when a person is learning something about themselves. That night, after John had gone to bed, Tyler stayed up a little longer. He didn't scroll his phone. He didn't text Jake or Marcus. Instead, he sat there, reading and rereading his apology letter. Every word felt heavier than the last. For the first time, he realized something that had never crossed his mind before. His actions didn't just affect him. They affected everyone. He folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Then, before heading to bed, he did something he'd never done before. He put his dirty clothes in the washing machine. No one told him to. No one watched him do it. But he did it anyway. The next week came and went, and while things in the Matthews household felt more balanced, they were far from perfect. John noticed that Tyler was doing things he'd never done before. He started washing his own clothes, not every day, but often enough that John could tell it wasn't a fluke. He also noticed that Tyler was cleaning up after himself at dinner, rinsing his plate and placing it in the dishwasher. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough for John to see that his son was starting to understand something bigger than chores. One evening, as John sat at the kitchen table, sipping on his evening coffee, Tyler walked in. It wasn't the usual entrance where he slumped past his dad like he was invisible. This time, Tyler sat down at the table across from him, hands clasped together like he had something to say but wasn't sure how to say it. John glanced up from his mug, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "What's on your mind, Ty?" he asked, setting the cup down. Tyler rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes looking everywhere except at his dad. "I was thinking about something," he started, his voice low and cautious. "Remember what you said in the truck?" About every choice shaping the man you're gonna be. John nodded, keeping his eyes steady on his son. Yeah, I remember. Why? Tyler hesitated for a moment, then exhaled deeply like he was about to unload something that had been sitting on his chest for a while. I don't think I've been making good choices, Dad. His words hung in the air like a confession. I mess around too much. I do stuff just 'cause my friends think it's funny. I don't know why I do it, I don't know. John leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes never leaving Tyler's face. That's honest, son. More honest than I've heard you be in a long time. Tyler's face softened at that. His shoulders, which had been tense since he sat down, finally dropped. He nodded slowly. Yeah, well, I'm tired of feeling stupid all the time. John tilted his head, his eyes narrowing with interest. Feeling stupid, huh? What makes you feel that way? Tyler shrugged, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. I see how you do stuff, Dad. How you always have it together. You get up early. You don't wait for anyone to tell you what to do. You just handle it. His voice cracked a little, and he swallowed hard to cover it. I guess I've been waiting for you to do it for me for too long. The words hit John in a way he didn't expect. He sat back, his eyes blinking a little more than usual. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence do the talking for a moment. He could see it in Tyler's face. The realization had already hit him. The moment of clarity that every parent waits for. He saw it happen in real time. Finally, John nodded slowly, his eyes locked on his son. You just figured out something it takes most men a lifetime to learn, Ty. He took a sip of his coffee and set it down gently. Nobody's coming to save you. You gotta save yourself. Tyler rubbed his hands over his face, then dropped them on the table with a loud sigh. Yeah, I get that now. John smiled a little, but it wasn't a gloating smile. It was a smile of quiet pride. You've been getting it, son. I've seen it. I just needed you to see it too. That weekend, something unexpected happened. It was Saturday morning, and John woke up at his usual time, 6 a.m., like clockwork. He got dressed, washed his face, and headed downstairs, expecting to start the day with his usual solo breakfast routine. But when he got to the kitchen, Tyler was already there. John froze for a second, his eyes darting around the room like he'd accidentally stepped into someone else's house. Tyler was standing at the stove, spatula in hand, flipping pancakes. Actual pancakes. Not frozen waffles. Not cereal. Pancakes. John leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, look of disbelief on his face. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, his voice carrying just enough volume for Tyler to hear. Tyler glanced over his shoulder, grinning in a way John hadn't seen since he was a little kid. I figured you'd want a break for once, he said, turning back to the pancakes. Don't get used to it, though. John let out a short laugh, the kind that comes from a place of genuine surprise. Don't worry, I won't, he said, walking over to the table and sitting down. But I'll enjoy it while it lasts. Tyler slid a plate of pancakes in front of him, along with a bottle of syrup. John glanced down at it, then back up at Tyler. You trying to impress me or something? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Maybe, Tyler shot back with a grin, sitting across from him. Or maybe I'm just tired of cereal. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the heavy kind of silence they'd shared before. This silence was different. It felt like peace. Every now and then, John would glance at Tyler, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Later that day, John got a call from the principal. At first, his heart sank. What now? He muttered as he picked up the phone. But it wasn't bad news. In fact, it was the opposite. Just wanted to let you know, Mr. Porter said on the other end of the line. Tyler turned in his apology letter today. Most kids scribble something to get it over with, but his letter stood out. It was thoughtful. I could tell he meant it. John's eyes lifted to the ceiling, a slow, quiet breath escaping him. Is that right? He said, glancing toward the window where Tyler was outside, mowing the lawn without being asked. Appreciate the call, Mr. Porter. When he hung up, John stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, his eyes focused on his son pushing the mower across the yard. He thought about his own father, how they'd barely spoken unless it was about work or discipline. How every life lesson came with a belt and a lecture. But this moment was different. This moment was proof that things can change. John stepped outside, hands in his pockets, watching Tyler work. Tyler saw him but didn't stop. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't groan or complain. He just kept pushing the mower like it was any other day. John smiled to himself, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew Tyler could feel it. Sometimes you don't have to say it. Sometimes they just know. After Tyler finished the last row, he stopped, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and looked at John. You need me to do anything else? John shook his head, hands still in his pockets. No, you've done plenty today. Tyler nodded, grabbing the gas can to refill the mower. He didn't look back. He didn't need to.